The glass shattered like an accusation. Rain drove itself against the windows of Elena Moretti's top-floor apartment as if to punish the city for not keeping its promises. She flinched, mug cracking under her fingers, porcelain spiderwebbing across the carpet, and when the door exploded inward, she already had the pistol. A small, old thing with a weight she remembered from a life before the museum, before the funeral wreaths and the way the mornings tasted of absence, clenched in her lap. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They moved like wet ghosts, three figures slipping through the smoke and steam of a city that had forgotten how to be quiet. The youngest, a boy with two big shoulders and calloused fingers, held a backpack that smelled of ozone and stolen opportunities. He went ahead, eyes hungry for easy prize. He thought this was a simple raid, cash, jewelry, something to show the bosses. He did not register the way the apartment felt like a held breath, the way a single photograph on the mantel read like a fuse. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the tallest one snarled, his voice practiced in menace. He wore leather like armor and a knife like a vow. The third kept to the shadows, hands in his pockets, watching the woman who sat very still on an armchair, her eyes not wild but cold with a grief that had calcified into precision. "Money, or we make it loud," the young leader said, and was about to take a step when Dante Varela stepped out of the shadow of the doorway behind Elena like a history that no one had read yet. He did not move like someone who owned buildings and influence and legacies of blood. He moved like a man who had learned to control the moment before it broke. His suit was an understatement. Perfect, black, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned against a jaw that had meant to be kinder. The intruders paused, surprise making their faces small and raw. Rumors made monsters. Dante made a hush. "You're on the wrong roof," he said softly, and the classroom lesson in his voice had killed even the bravado in the room. Elena felt something unwrap inside her, something that had lived through other nights of guns and silence. She kept the pistol between her knees. She felt ridiculous and steady and, for reasons she could not always name, less alone. "Who the hell is?" the leader started. The knife glinted. Marco, the youngest, hands shaking, found the name didn't matter. He let his mouth work into a grin that wasn't a smile and reached for the backpack, for the ledger that, according to the blueprints that had cost him more favors than he cared to count, would change everything. Dante watched him like someone reading the last page of a book he had not finished. There was amusement in the lines at the corners of his eyes, but not surprise. He had known, perhaps, that the city moved in cycles of hunger and violence, that the syndicates made labyrinths of promises. He had not expected tonight. No patriarch ever expected to walk into the living room of the woman who had once saved his life and find thieves made small by a pistol and a chipped mug. "Leave the ledger," Dante said. "Out." The word was a small thunderclap. Elena's heart thudded under her ribs like a child trying to be brave. The youngest lad, who had once sat in a basement and taught himself to crack security with the patience of a saint and the despair of a man who'd never been loved, swallowed. Marco's throat worked. The ledger in his pack glowed in his peripheral vision like a future he'd never been allowed to hold. It contained transactions, names, the kind of receipts that could unravel reputations and topple empires. "Leave the ledger," Dante said. "Out." The word was a small thunderclap. Elena's heart thudded under her ribs like a child trying to be brave. The youngest lad, who had once sat in a basement and taught himself to crack security with the patience of a saint and the despair of a man who'd never been loved, swallowed. Marco's throat worked. The ledger in his pack glowed in his peripheral vision like a future he'd never been allowed to hold. It contained transactions, names, the kind of receipts that could unravel reputations and topple empires. It would make him notorious in the right kind of dangerous way. It would make his mother finally stop worrying about dinner money. He didn't move. "You going to make us leave?" the tallest asked. He raised his knife, a practiced intimidation, and the smaller intruder, an older woman with a braid white with stress, moved to cover the window like an anchor. The scene bristled. Elena felt the pistol under her hand like a heartbeat she'd forgotten. Dante's shadow fell across the torn photograph on the mantel. The picture showed a younger Elena and a man with a wide smile, her husband, Alessandro, leaning into her under the sun. The name had been a talisman, a ward against patience and pity. Elena had kept it the way people keep heirlooms, because some things, when let go, do not return. Every game in the city had rules, even the dirty ones. There were debts and reprisal, honor and bloodlines that didn't die with a funeral. Dante had come to live with Elena because of such rules. She had saved him once from a bullet that was meant for blood and family. And he had sworn to repay her with a roof and protection and, more complicatedly, with the quieting of his presence in her life. He had balanced on that pledge for 2 years, moving between boardrooms and safe rooms, between being the public face of Varela Cyber and the private arm of an old oath. Now the oath pried at a new seam. "You're Dante Varela," the woman with the braid hissed. Her eyes flicked to the man they presumed himself to be just a rumor about. "They told us stories, didn't think they were true." Dante smiled in the way dangerous things do, the leisure of a predator who liked to be underestimated. "Stories are currency," he said, "and currency can be made worthless with one wrong exchange." Marco felt like the world narrowed to the sound of his breathing. He'd been taught to trust systems, to understand the architecture of secrets. He had not been taught how to weigh the human heart in a room like this. Elena's face was a map he didn't know how to read. Grief had softened and sharpened her, painting her as someone who would not cower. There was a ferocity to her small, deliberate movements that made him think of metal against water. "Back out," Dante repeated. There was an edge now, a line drawn in the carpet that no man wanted to cross. "There is nothing here worth the trouble you will invite." The leader laughed. "You expect us to believe the boss lives with a widow? What is this? Redemption for a saved life? Or is it a setup? Maybe she's bait." "She's nobody to use as a pawn," Elena said. The words came faster than she knew she had them. Her voice forgot the museum rules of calm and catalog and used instead the language of a woman who had spent 2 years refining a new survival. Direct, clear. "We don't have to be villains tonight." "Then produce your valuables and we leave," the leader said, eyes on the ledger like a man praying to a relic. Dante's hand moved almost unconsciously toward his waist, where guns were hidden and favors hoarded. Elena's fingers tightened on the pistol, even though she didn't intend to use it. She found herself scared not for the ledger, but for the small things. The photograph, the chipped mug she hadn't wanted to throw away because it had been Alessandro's. The way her morning started with the ghost of his laughter. "There's something else," Dante said quietly, and in his voice was a history more intimate than fear. "You take what isn't yours here, and you extinguish a light you don't know how to relight." The young one's name had once been a secret to him. Now it was a face that couldn't be categorized by allegiance. Marco's eyes met Elena's. For a moment, in the space between gunmetal and rain, something passed. She saw a boy who had never been allowed to keep a promise to himself. He looked like a man who'd learned to survive by theft, and who now believed the ledger would be his harvest. "This is bigger than us," Marco said. The words were both an excuse and a plea. "You don't get it. They will eat us alive if we don't deliver." "Who will?" Dante asked. The boardroom of his mind unfurled like a map, territory and threat and allegiances. The Varellas have no patience for those who break into the wrong apartments. "Varellas," the woman with the braids spat, as if the name had teeth. "You made that your life." There was a history passing between the lines. Elena's dead husband's connection to Dante, once allies, now fractured by betrayal, was a truth she had folded into a private life, an ember kept from igniting. She had not spoken it aloud because the past had teeth, and she feared what it meant for the man who had kept coming to her in nights after the funeral, bringing rice and silence and the kind of protection that smelled of oil and money. She had accepted his presence because she needed it, not because she trusted it. Dante, for his part, had remained at a distance not entirely of his own choosing. He had loved safety and the sanctity of an oath. He had not allowed himself to fall in the house of a woman tied to a name that might bring him ruin. He kept the depth of his feelings folded into the strict geometry of his promises. Outside, the rain intensified, a drumbeat that measured the escalating heartbeat of the room. Marco's hand trembled as he unfastened the backpack. The leader laughed, thinking the ledger would justify everything. For all their bravado, they did not realize that some houses hold skeletons not meant to be dragged into the street. Elena's mouth went dry. She had a choice she had rehearsed in 1,000 solitary hours. Let them go and take the risk that their return would be worse, or stand and force a reckoning she had avoided because it meant naming the crimes tied to her husband's name. She remembered Alessandro's laughter in better days, his hands folding into hers at midnight, and the secrets they had kept that had become barbed wire between friends and families. There were names, inked like wounds, that could not be lifted without ripping the fabric he had left. "Stop," Dante said, and in his tone was a snap that bent the room. "Put the ledger down. Walk out with your heads bowed. I will tell you now. The first person who moves like a threat dies quietly. The second gets the street's attention. And the third, we end this tonight with a precedent." The leader snarled and raised his knife, a decision coiled like a snake. Marco, eyes bright, the ledger like a promise on his chest, thought of what he'd been taught in basements and on nights when the world offered no tenderness. He thought of his mother waiting for rent money. He thought of the ledger like a fulcrum. He did not yet know that the thing he aimed for would not simply be property to be traded. The rain outside softened to a whisper, as if the city leaned in to hear the choices being made within a room built from grief and power. Elena felt the pistol shake under her palm, and for the first time since she had become a widow, she considered not the past, but the way a future could be forced to open by a single steady breath. The dilemma spread in the air. Keep the ledger close and spark a war that could burn the fragile peace around her, or sacrifice the possibility of truth to maintain a safety that might be a cage. She looked at Dante, saw in the lines of his face the ghosts of his own debts, and then at Marco, whose life had been written by other people's betrayals. The night hung between them like a coin spun in fate's palm. "Decide," the leader said, and the apartment held its breath for the answer. Elena's fingers were the slowest thing in the room. It felt as if the world had been put through syrup, and she was the last object left to move. "We don't have to make this martyrdom," she said, voice rawer than she meant. The pistol's weight steadied her, a talisman she had learned to trust. "Leave the ledger and go. Take whatever you need from me, not from the house." Marco's eyes flicked to her in a moment that felt like an electric current. Hesitation, recognition, hunger, and something softer that surprised him. He imagined he saw in Elena a life he had never been allowed. Ordinary mornings with coffee, a job that smelled of dust and order, a grief so worn it had been folded into the furniture. He also felt the ledger, a heavy truth inside his pack, insist. The leader's knife trembled in his hand the way a ruler trembles when an empire falters. "Easy words for someone sitting behind a gun," the leader said. His voice was a whip. "Prove it. Let her pick what we take. If it's not enough, we take the ledger anyway." Elena looked at Dante. The man she had known as a shadow in daylight, as a courier of quiet protection, loosened his jaw as if breaking a spool. His eyes were not the hard stones the gossip made them. They were amber and weary and somehow more dangerous because they held pity. "If they leave without it, they leave something else," he said. The sentence felt like a negotiation disguised as a warning. You walk away with small change and your lives. You take the ledger and you carry with you a war that will not distinguish criminals from children. I know you. I know the faces of those who burn bridges for profit. Once this ledger leaves this room, your names will mean different things." The leader laughed, a brittle sound. "You threaten like a man who has never starved." "I threatened like a man who has kept his people alive," Dante replied. "There are debts you cannot cash without the market reacting." Marco's breath came faster. There were people behind him, older, brutal, the kind who knew how to make a city's law choke on its own blood, and he had promised them a result. In the ledger was a code, a list of transfer schedules and shell companies that, once exposed to the right eyes, would topple alliances and unmask names that were supposed to belong only to whispers. He had joined the syndicate for survival. He had imagined himself a ghost who would step into prominence. He had not intended, in any of his nights awake with the glow of screens, to look into a living, breathing woman and feel unsettled. "Elena," Dante said quietly, stepping so that his shadow crossed the ledger like a guardian. "If this leaves, if it's ever seen in the open, Alessandro's name will drag you into something you cannot walk back from." The air did something small, folded, then expanded. The photograph of Alessandro on the mantel was suddenly a totem of provenance and shame. Her husband's smile now looked like a promise that had never been kept. Elena had kept his name as her own because it had been all that remained of a man who had once been a partner, not an accomplice. She thought of the museums she ran, of artifacts cataloged and labeled, of the way history could be rewritten with a single ledger. She had known, abstractly at first, that Alessandro had ties. The details had arrived like splinters, minor at first, then embedded. "This isn't about me," she said. The words were softer, but not tired. "It's about everyone who gets hurt if the ledger goes where they want it to go. I won't be the reason a son buries a mother because some syndicate wants leverage." Marco's hand curled around the zipper of his pack. He could feel the ledger's edge under his palm through canvas, rigid, important. He started, and then stopped, because his private pleas did nothing to change the arithmetic of names and power in a room that had been held by ghosts long before they arrived. "You think we don't have mothers?" the woman with the braids spat. Her voice broke on mothers, and a memory flickered in her face, of a kitchen table and unpaid bills, and a boy who had been too clever for his own good. She had not expected to be moved by a widow and a ledger. The criminal life had a way of calcifying compassion until it was brittle. Tonight, something hit it and flaked. Dante looked at the three intruders as if measuring each like a chess piece. "You have 1 minute to make the right choice." His fingers were not on any visible weapon now. They were on the room, on its confessions and its dangers. Put it on the floor. Walk to the door. You leave with your dignity, if you can find any left." The leader snarled, a sound of small men. Marco's throat worked. He thought he could bargain. He imagined a negotiation in which the ledger was swapped for another ledger, for favors, for a life in which his mother stopped worrying about rent. He had not reckoned with Dante's stubbornness, the kind that did not always show in boardrooms, but did in the calculus of killing or sparing a whole street. There was a promise in Dante's stillness that felt like an impossible weight. Elena watched Marco as if watching a wounded bird decide whether to take flight. "If you take that ledger, you will be someone else's weapon," she said, "and you will always be hunted. If you leave it, you can try to build something else. I can help you with that. There are people who will listen. Not my husband." She stopped, breath snagged. Not anymore. Her offer landed oddly. It was not charity. It was a civic bargain from a woman who had spent her life preserving other people's stories. It had the sound of something real, someone willing to help a life pivot. Marco's eyes softened, the ledger suddenly a burden instead of a crown. The leader barked at him, furious at any sign of mercy. "We're not here for your lectures," he said. "We're here for profit." "Profits cost people," Elena whispered. "Profits cost mothers, like mine, like yours." Her voice broke. The pistol trembled. The leader saw that and moved forward, blade flicking like a question. Dante's hand found the back of a chair, hard and steady. And in that motion, Elena realized he was choosing the line between attack and restraint for both of them. He was a man who could command storms, yet chose to fold one night into another, to keep from detonating the city into chaos over a ledger. "Enough," Dante said. "If you take it, you leave me no choice but to act, not just for me, but for the men under me who expect retribution. If you leave it, you can pretend nothing happened." Pretend? The word was a fossil in Elena's mouth, one she'd chewed on since the funeral. Pretending had kept her whole and also kept her small. She had been safer pretending grief turned her gentle, that she would never mount a defense of herself beyond a pistol and the occasional quiet plea to the heavens. But tonight pretenses felt dishonest, like a museum label that told only the surface truth. Marco's fingers loosened. He set the pack on the floor with a clatter, as if it had weight beyond its canvas. The leader's grin died, a sudden animal caught mid-hunt. The ledger lay on the rug. Its presence was an accusation. Marco's eyes were wet, embarrassed, frightened. "We can't just walk away," he said. "They'll kill us if we come back empty-handed." "Then you'll make a choice," Dante said. "Use the ledger to negotiate, or hand it to me, and I will ensure your names are folded away. You will not be celebrated. You will be kept. The alternative is an ugly public ledger that calls every favor and burns every name. Decide." The intruders looked at each other like a pack trying to recall the rules of survival they had learned in blood. The woman with the braid made the first move. She stepped forward, the lines on her face patterned with battle, and pushed the ledger toward Dante with a motion full of relief and fear. "We take our chances," she said, hating the tremor in her voice. "We stand down for now." The leader's hands trembled. He had never before bowed. He had always been the hand that took. Pride flamed in his chest like something large and malevolent. And yet, his fingers closed around the leather edge of the ledger as if he were holding his future and decided to let go. Slowly, agonizingly, he moved back. The air exhaled, a city-sized sigh that seemed to pass through the window and into the rain. Dante didn't reach for the ledger. He let the leader's decision land. There was something magnanimous and then terrifying in his restraint. He could have taken their heads and all of their names with a quiet tweet to men who held interest and grudges. Instead, he kept watch. "Leave now," he said. "And if you ever set foot near this building again, I will find you. I will not kill you for the sake of spectacle. I will make your lives small, constant punishments meant to teach an expensive lesson." They fled with the silence of men who had cheated a noose. The youngest, Marco, paused at the door. He looked at Elena as if trying to memorize what mercy looked like. "Why?" he asked, voice barely breath. Elena's answer was as simple as a household truth. "Because no ledger is worth watching someone die for," she said. "And because I was once saved." Outside, the rain took them like a secret. Inside, Elena sat back, as if exhaling for the first time in years. Dante moved to the mantel and picked up the photograph, his fingers brushing the frame like a benediction or a sin. "You put yourself in danger," he said, not accusing, but naming. "I put myself in truth," she corrected, "and for once, the truth kept me." Dante studied her as if reading labels of a relic he had never dared touch. "You don't owe me anything for staying," he murmured. And yet, he stopped, the unfinished sentence hanging. The ledger had not been handed over to him. It had been left on the floor in a compromise that smelled like truce. The city outside would rearrange itself because of the night. Rumors would swell, men would make mental ledgers of their own, and somewhere, someone would decide to press an advantage. They had delayed a storm, but not diverted it. Marco's pack remained by the door, empty of the ledger, but full of other things. Worn wires, a torn photograph of a woman with a laugh he recognized as his own mother. Elena thought of how easily lives could be traded on the marketplace of secrets and felt a fierce, maternal protectiveness flare toward the intruder-turned-boy. Dante, who had seen more than his share of such bargains, watched her with something like awe. "You could walk away from this," he said. "Leave, and I will make sure they don't find you." She shook her head. "People don't get to walk away. They get to live with the choices they make. Same for you." Dante's jaw tightened. "And you? Will you live with the knowledge that you held a truth and let it go?" "I will live with the knowledge that I decided people were more important than a ledger," she said. "Tonight, that is enough." He closed his eyes as if to savor it, a small, unclothed moment of gratitude that had no place in his life of contracts and violence. He had been given a choice he had refused to accept for a long time: to dominate or to preserve. He chose the latter not because he was noble, but because he had learned that the cost of retribution sometimes ate the very thing it claimed to protect. In the quiet that followed, the rain, a steady metronome, the apartment felt reconstructed. Elena realized how charged the room had been and how suddenly ordinary it was again. A mug, a pistol, a photograph, and the faint perfume of a man who wore power like a second skin. For the first time since Alessandro's funeral, she allowed herself to imagine a night that wasn't defined by absence. But the ledger had been spared, and men who wanted what it contained would not forget. The compromise was a temporary peace, a thin voile between them and an inevitable storm. Yet in that fragile calm, Dante and Elena found an unexpected ally, the intruder who had set down his pack and looked at them not as enemies, but as human beings who had made difficult choices. In that exchange, under a roof that smelled of rain and old secrets, the first true crack of a new kind of alliance appeared, one built not on ledgers, but on the messy, stubborn business of mercy. Outside, the city continued to pulse with rumor and appetite. Inside, Elena realized her life was no longer only a museum of grief. It was a place where decisions were made and hearts were risked. She had gambled with a ledger and won a conversation she had long avoided, about truth, about protection, about the cost of secrets. Dante, who had lived his life as if every night could be the last negotiation, had chosen to spare lives rather than claim them. Marco had left with no ledger, but something else, an imprint of mercy that would haunt him as surely as any threat. When the door had finally clicked shut against the rain, the apartment felt less like a monument and more like a home that had weathered a storm. The next moves, retaliations, inquiries, the tug of other men who'd noticed the aborted theft would come. But for now, Elena sat with Dante, the pistol resting across her knees, and allowed herself the small, terrible comfort of being seen. The ledger was a shadow in the room. So were the debts. They would find their way forward, not because the world was kinder, but because 3 people had, against coding and bloodlines, decided to be merciful. The first time Elena slept after they left, she dreamt of ledger pages fanning out like the wings of a bird, each name a feather falling into the river. She woke with her heart hollowed and the pistol warm under her palm, as if it had soaked up the night's mercy and wouldn't let it go. Dante was already awake, sleeves rolled, staring at the city as if trying to read an invisible script running across roofs and alleys. He did not speak for a long time. The photograph of Alessandro leaned against a stack of museum catalogs. Its edges were softened by touch and denial. "This will change people," Dante said finally, not a warning so much as an observation. Rain had tapered into a gleam on the glass, and the city's lights blinked like a heartbeat. His voice held a tiredness she had begun to recognize as the weight of families and ledgers and choices. "It already has," Elena replied. "It changed us last night." He turned to her. For a man whose life had been measured in leverage and strategy, his face, when he looked at her, was undecorated. Concern, calculation, and an affection that trembled on the edge of confession. She felt exposed and not afraid of being seen. That was itself dangerous. Dante's network would now sense a disturbance, whispers that the ledger had been close to being taken, rumors that the Varela roof sheltered odd alliances. He would measure that against his obligation to keep Elena safe and his propensity for swift, often brutal corrections. He would also weigh the ledger's absence from the public ledger as a problem for rivals who loved spectacle and feared being kept in the dark. "We need to assume they'll try again," Dante said. This was reconnaissance. They came to see whether the legend had teeth. It did. That makes us a target. "Then we prepare," Elena answered, thinking of the museum's cataloging systems, of inventory lists and access logs she could manipulate. It felt obscene to use her life's work as a tool in a war that had nothing to do with artifacts, but maybe her knowledge of preservation was a kind of armor. She imagined rewriting the ledger's path into oblivion, making it a rumor that would die in the mouths that fed on such appetites. "You could leave," Dante suggested, almost offhand, though his hand curled slightly, as if reaching to measure the consequences of the suggestion. "For a while. Go overseas. I can secure a house, an identity. It would be safer." The offer was familiar, yet foreign. He'd offered shelter through the long seasons after the funeral, practical kindnesses wrapped in a neat package. This offer was different. It smelled like exile, a removal of her from the world where her husband's name still had weight. It would be both protection and punishment, the bodyguarding of a ghost. "I can't leave my work," Elena said. "Not like this. People come to me for records. I keep histories so people won't lie about them later. If I walk away now, someone else will find those pages and decide what story to tell." Dante's jaw flexed. "Stories can be dangerous." "So can hiding them," she replied. "If the ledger is a map to harm, someone needs to guard the map until it can be burned or buried properly. I won't be the coward who abdicates to fear." He looked at her as if seeing depth in a gallery slide. "You are reckless with sentiment," he said, a rueful smile touching his mouth. "You choose principles over prudence." "Someone has to," Elena said. The pistol, cleaned and away, had been returned to its case. It felt too crystallized to be holstered among museum gloves and catalog sheets. "If I had to live with a secret, I'd rather live with it intentionally." Dante considered, then nodded, an accession of respect. "Then we will protect the ledger's silence together, but not as enemies who merely tolerate each other's presence. You'll let me help with the practicalities." She agreed. They began to move through the day with the taut quiet of people rebuilding after an intruder's audition. Dante set men to sweep the neighborhood, to watch and listen. Elena adjusted the museum's loading protocols and encrypted archives, creating an artificial trail that made the ledger look like a harmless corporate memo instead of a detonator. It was the odd intimacy of pairs who had chosen to merge operations. His muscle and money, her knowledge and ethics. Each complemented and complicated the other. The city's appetite didn't quiet. Word ran through quieter channels, and Marco's absence, the ledger still in the apartment's possession, fed gossip like kindling. The syndicate he worked for would not leave such a humiliation unremarked. Men who had been promised profit and revenge would ask for accounts. Spies would note the aborted attempt and file it as intelligence against both Elena and Dante. Dante understood how reputations could be weaponized. Elena understood how reputations could be costumes worn to justify cruelty. 3 days later, a man arrived at the museum with credentials he might have had if years had allowed him different choices. He moved like someone polished by politics, comfortable in polished shoes, and said the right things about donations and endowments. He was a foot in a door. Elena's smile didn't reach her eyes when she watched him circle the galleries like a predator disguised as a philanthropist. She felt the ledger's absence like a bruise. That night, while cataloging incoming donations, she found a thin envelope slipped under the museum's back door. It contained a photograph, grainy like a left-behind film, of Marco standing outside a building she recognized as a safe house for lower-tier syndicate members. On the back, in a scrawl that could only be Dante's, someone had written, "He knows where his choices led him." Elena felt icy. She took the photograph to Dante. He examined it and then sat down, fingers pinching the bridge of his nose. "They'll use him. They'll make him a symbol of failure and of what happens to those who cross the wrong people." "Can you save him?" she asked. The question was simple and stupid, threaded with something that had hardened into protective instinct. "I can buy him time," Dante said, "but buying time costs more than money. It costs leverage, and I have less of it than I like to admit." "You can buy him a new life," Elena insisted. "Not a lie, but a way out. He left his ledger here because he didn't know what to do with his courage. We could give him a place to start." The idea lodged itself between them like a shard. Dante was a man whose decisions reverberated beyond individual lives. Spare a boy, and a line of men might grow emboldened. Destroy a rival, and the city would realign in unpredictable ways. He thought through his files. The ledger would draw vultures. But Elena's offer pricked at something in him, an old oath that had once kept a bullet from finishing its arc. "There's risk," he said, "not only to him, but to you. If they discover we've sheltered him, they will test us." "I know," she said. She felt a thin fury rise inside her for the way the world asked certain people to shrink. "And I am done shrinking." Dante's hand brushed the photograph, and then left it. "We do this my way," he said. "We don't bribe our way out of obligations. We make a new agreement." And so they planned. Dante's men staged a false trail, distributing rumors that the ledger had been sold to a rival and moved out of the city. They orchestrated anonymous tips pointing to dead ends, false servers in foreign countries, phantom shell companies. Elena worked with a reluctant contact at the museum's digital archive to create a plausible fudging of access logs. a breadcrumb trail that would satisfy a search party long enough to dissipate threats. It was all elegant duplicity, the kind of art she had once despised when used by courtiers, now a necessary preservation of life. Yet secrets multiply like mold in damp corners. The more they covered, the more suspicious the world became. Someone inside the syndicate wanted not just the ledger, but revenge for the humiliation of being thwarted. The leader who had led the raid would not disappear into obscurity. Pride, greed, survival. These were persistent forces. Elena felt the strain of holding a truth and a deception at once. Dante felt the politics of sparing a life and knew the bill would arrive in paper cuts. Marco, for his part, did not know the full extent of the plans made on his behalf. He lay low, trading the ledger for silence and a new alias, shivering with gratitude and guilt. He wrote Elena a short, shaky note. "Thank you. I don't know if I deserve this." He left it under the door of a church where she sometimes went to find quiet objects to study. The note tasted like a confession. When Elena read Marco's handwriting in the hush of the church, with shafts of afternoon light cutting the dust into wings, she felt the room tilt. She had offered mercy and not demanded penance in return. It was a radical act. It was also not enough. Men who had been fed on cycles of retribution would not simply accept mercy without recalibrating their appetite. Within the week, a courier delivered a single line: "We notice who shelters your secrets." Dante answered with a calm that had been paid for in years of violence. He made a public gesture of care, a donation to a civic project, a speech about protecting cultural heritage, and privately tightened security around the museum and Elena's building. He also summoned his most discreet enforcers and asked, with the kind of softness that had teeth, that they locate the leader who had once blade-tipped the air in his apartment and make sure he remembered what it meant to step into a Varela territory uninvited. "Don't become them," Elena said once, seeing the way his hands curled around lists and names. "Don't let our mercy be the kind that breeds the violence you promised not to favor." Dante's eyes were unreadable, the way a ledger withheld its balance. "I do not intend to become them," he said, "but I will use their language if it keeps you breathing." She wanted to ask him what breathing cost in his world. Instead, she cataloged an ancient coin and tried to remember how Alessandro used to hum in the kitchen. The coin was cold and beautiful and impartial, and for a moment she imagined a life in which decisions didn't have bifurcating consequences. The imagination was a luxury she could not afford. Around them, the city's machinery of rumor and threat moved like tide. The ledger remained folded into memory, a secret neither buried nor broadcast. And the fractures that would come from this hiding had only just begun to map themselves across faces and loyalties. At night, Elena sometimes woke at the sound of a car slowing outside, hollow with dread until it passed. Dante slept with his phone out, awake to the possibility that a call would set events in motion. The choice to spare Marco had felt moral and right. It was also a hinge that swung toward unknown consequences. Secrets pooled around them like water in the gutter, and every man who had once lived by ledger and favor could smell the moisture and begin to scheme. One morning, a message arrived not in the hands of a courier, but scrawled on public bathroom stall walls in a district known for political graffiti. Names and numbers and a date. It was a threat and a dare. Elena read it and felt the ledger's shadow coil toward her like a snake preparing to strike. She realized with a clarity that made her hands tremble that what they'd traded, a ledger for a life, might not be a bargain but a down payment on conflict. She thought of Marco's mother's face in that torn photograph she had seen. She thought of Alessandro's hand once wrapped around hers. She thought, with a sudden, burning certainty, that truth had teeth and sometimes those teeth had to be shown. The fractures that had been only hairline cracks widened into canyons. Allies chose sides. Old friends who had once kept quiet when corruption touched their hands now cleared their throats. Dante's network shifted like tectonic plates under pressure, while Elena's social world at the museum trembled when donors asked delicate questions about safety. And in the center of it all, Marco moved as if caught between two fires, the one that had once promised him power and the one that had shown him mercy. The ledger had become a lens through which everyone measured themselves. For some, it was a weapon. For others, an indictment. For Elena, it was the instrument by which she had chosen to refuse the city's cruelty. And that refusal, quietly heroic and terribly costly, would not go untested. The cracks widened into rifts, and the people who had been steady beneath their feet revealed, with the thin mercilessness of history, what they would sacrifice and whom they would betray when pressed. They came at 3 in the morning, not with the swagger of men sure of victory, but with the quiet of people who had rehearsed violence until it felt like muscle memory. Tires whispered over wet asphalt. Footsteps swallowed themselves in the alley. Elena woke to the metallic scent of fear and the small, precise vibration in Dante's pocket that had the cadence of orders. He slid from bed like a shadow, obeying an old command, and moved for the door before she could say his name. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They met at the top stair, two people who had learned to breathe under pressure. The city outside was a wet black ribbon, anonymous and hungry. Dante's men were calm. Elena's hands were steady in ways that surprised even her. The note left on the bathroom wall 3 days earlier had been a promise. Names, a date, a threat. Someone had turned the ledger's near theft into a gauntlet. Tonight, they would decide whether to pick it up. Dante briefed her in clipped sentences, the kind that belonged to men who had cut emotion into efficient pieces. "They'll try to draw us out," he said. "They'll want a spectacle. We make one on our terms." Elena touched the photograph of Alessandro in her jacket pocket, as if gathering courage from a relic. She felt the ledger like a heartbeat in the belly of the building, present, dangerous, and not yet a thing to be given away. Marco's absence had become a calculus in Dante's mind. The ledger had become a lightning rod. And now, as much as she resented the world that wanted to clothe itself in violence, she understood that some defenses required the language of confrontation. They left the apartment together. Dante at her elbow was a careful thing to be near. His proximity had always felt like a lit fuse, both comforting and terrifying. She realized, with a clarity that made her chest ache, that she trusted him enough to stand where bullets might find them both. For a man who bent markets and men, his most dangerous attribute had become his willingness to be accountable where others hide behind proxies. The first move unfolded in the courtyard. A car stalled, then flung into reverse, a trumpet of noise meant to disorient. Men with faces half hidden tried to force their way into the entry, expecting a defensive scramble, a show of dominance. Dante's team answered like a rehearsed chorus. Positions taken, exit sealed, non-lethal force preferred, but lethal readiness evident. The intruders were not amateurs. They had been coached to eschew honor, to trade it for a quick score. The leader from the earlier raid stood at the center of the attackers, the same knife-aired menace, but his eyes now carried a different calculation. Reckoning or desperation, Elena couldn't tell which. They clashed in a frantic ballet that felt too intimate for anything that mattered. Elena found herself at the edge of rooms she had only walked through in daylight, the museum's lights now a blind spot. She had expected to watch men fight. She had not expected to find herself caught in the physics of fear when a man lunged for her with the blunt end of a crowbar. Dante intercepted with breathless speed, pushing the man past her shoulder with a violence that looked like tenderness. He did not crush the attacker, he redirected him. The motion was a confession. Dante could kill. He chose not to when there was another path. The leader moved like a viper sensing an opportunity and dove for the stairwell where an access corridor ran down to the museum's storage, where Dante had suggested they stash the most sensitive documents, and where the ledger, in a risky plan, had been hidden under layers of archival falsehood. Elena felt a lurch of panic. The ledger's safety was no longer abstract. Men might die for it tonight. Marco's voice cracked somewhere below, a surprised shout, and then a machine gun bark of command. Dante's name was used in curse and prayer as his operatives sealed doors and disabled weapons with the clinical efficiency of men authorized to erase threats and balance ledgers. Elena ran toward the stairwell, heart alternating between dread and a peculiar, gorgeous adrenaline that made every corner of her feel awake. She had no place in this fight except the one she had chosen, to stand and not let the ledger determine who they were. At the bottom of the stair, the scene was a tableau of choices. Marco stood with his back to a wall, hands up, sweat cutting clean lines through the grime on his cheeks. The leader loomed over him, a pistol in his hand, and the kind of fury that made men forget consequences. Dante's enforcers formed a semicircle, not to theatrically threaten, but to remove avenues of escape. The leader sneered at Dante, as if the man's restraint was a weakness to exploit. "Hand it over," he spat, fingers clenching on the pistol, "or we make examples." Marcos's eyes were wide enough to be honest. Behind him, the ledger, unseen to anyone but the men who had hidden it in an archival crate, throbbed like a dark heart. Elena stepped forward, the museum's air heavy with dust and history, and put herself between the leader and the young man. It was a small, naked thing to do, but one that felt like an uncoiling of every promise she'd made to herself since the funeral. Protect the fragile, protect the living. "You don't have to burn him to prove you're not small," she said. Her voice was steady, though it shook from adrenaline. "He's not your enemy. Your hunger isn't an argument for killing." The leader laughed, a bitter, cracked sound, and fired anyway, intending perhaps to graze or threaten, but the bullet struck the metal of a display case Dante had closed in the moment, a ricochet that gouged air and tore fabric from history. Elena flinched as if the sound had bitten her. In that instant, Dante moved with the lethal precision everyone feared. His hand was on the leader's wrist, a twist, then a snap that disarmed the pistol and hurled it away like a relic of a sin. Men fell into silence, breath caught like a held prayer. The leader, suddenly just a man with a bleeding lip and a sudden, humiliating defeat, glared as Dante's hand pressed to his throat, not to kill, but to immobilize. Dante's voice was low and terrible. "You vowed spectacle," he said. "Tonight, you made a mistake." The leader spat, then, a small admission, laughed in that animal way that was now stripped of bravado. He'd wanted leverage. He'd gotten reckoning. He had not expected Elena's defiance. He had not expected the ledger to be less an object and more a catalyst for mercy. In the aftermath, while men were bound and sirens were distant futures, Marco slid to the floor and pressed his forehead to his knees. He was trembling with a kind of gratitude that felt like shame. Elena, adrenaline burning down into an ache that made her bones feel like raw wood, sat beside him. Dante's hand brushed the back of her neck in a motion so small it could have been a habit, a comfort given with the economy of men who mistrust their own softness. "You could have left," Dante said, voice thin with something like fear for what he might have cost her. I could not let him die on my account, she answered simply, and I could not stand by while men used ledger pages as warrants for blood. Marco looked up at her, eyes rimmed red. I thought, he started, then stopped. I thought when I stole the ledger, I'd take my life somewhere else. I didn't know mercy could be... His sentence broke on the impossible word. A choice, Elena finished. Yes. Dante watched them both, and for the first time since he'd arrived at her door 2 years ago as a promise he would keep, allowed himself the small, ruinous act of admitting what sat beneath his ribs. He bent and pressed his forehead briefly to hers, not a kiss, but a punctuation that had all the weight of a vow. I will take responsibility for what follows, he said, for the ledger, for the men who wanted it, and for you. Elena felt something uncoil and realign in her chest. The confession was not theatrical. It was a hand offered in a war of margins. She had feared his love because of what love in his world demanded, sacrifices that could be measured in lives. But to hear him claim consequence was to know she was not alone. They held each other like conspirators and like civilians in a moment of truce. And Marco, watching, felt a path unseen until now. Restitution instead of theft, work instead of spectacle. Dante had made a choice that would ripple through his networks, a choice to protect rather than punish, and the cost would be paid in cleared houses and allegiance rebalanced. It would not be clean. It would be messy and political and possibly violent in the weeks to come. But in the small ring of light beneath the museum's emergency ladder, a man who could have killed had instead disarmed a pistol, and a widow who had been taught to shrink had planted herself between bloodlust and a young man who had merely sought to survive. It was, they all understood, even as officers would later catalog wounds and names, a small victory against the ledger's impossible gravity. Dante's sacrifice came not in the form of a gunshot, but of exposure. He signed a paper that night, an informal binding with an old adversary's emissary, a concession of influence in a small market in exchange for the leader's exile and silence. He lost men who had served him, shelved projects that fed his public empire, and handed rivals a crumb that would keep them from roaring. The price was something he could afford materially, but would cost him in the calculus of power. He paid willingly, because Elena had stepped into his life and refused to be a secret kept behind his walls. When dawn broke, indifferent and pale, Elena sat on the museum steps with Dante beside her and Marco leaning against the stone, newly inexperienced in gratitude. The ledger remained hidden, for now, its existence a quiet wound that only they treated with careful hands. Dante's eyes, tired, honest, human, met Elena's. "I will not ask you to leave again," he said. "If you stay with choice and protection." She reached for his hand and squeezed. "Then stay," she said. "Stay with me in the open places, not only in the safe rooms." He smiled, a cracked, genuine thing, and the city hummed around them, indifferent but also reconfigured. The sacrifice he made that night was not of flesh, but of empire. A decision to shrink his reach so the ledger would not be more than paper and the boy's life would not be currency. It was the most dangerous kind of surrender, the kind that men like him rarely chose. They had gained breathing room at a cost. The ledger's threat had been deferred but not dissolved. The reconciliation between Elena and Dante had hardened into action. He would use his resources not to annihilate the ledger's pursuers, but to create alternatives, safe passages, legal loopholes, and a network that could hide the consequences of a single bad choice. In doing so, he risked his standing. In doing so, he offered a glimpse of what his power could protect rather than punish. It was a beginning made of uneasy bargains and soft confessions. It was, in the vocabulary of their world, a radical theft of violence in favor of mercy. And when Marco rose at last, shoulders straightening under the weight of decisions he had not known how to take, he looked at both of them with a gratitude that had the sharpness of remorse and the sweetness of possibility. They walked back into the museum together as the city exhaled, leaving behind men bound and breathing, a ledger hidden in the boons of a building, and a fragile, newly declared allegiance among three people who had learned how to take the most sacred kind of risk, to save someone because love, of different shapes, had demanded it. They rebuilt the quiet as if it were a fragile exhibit, measured, reverent, and designed to survive touch. In the weeks after the raid, the city breathed around them, rumor and threat ebbing into the work Dante set his people to, repairs, whispered bargains, the slow business of smoothing edges so that hunters found less motive to circle. Elena cataloged what she could. Donors' visits logged with new scrutiny. Archival trails cleaned and rerouted. The ledger's ghost reduced to a fabric of false leads and diplomatic obscurations. It existed somewhere between paper and myth, inaccessible enough to deter thieves and too unstable to be weaponized. Marco kept his promise in the small, stubborn ways people redeem themselves. He found steady labor in the museum's restoration lab, hands relearning patience as he mended torn bindings under Elena's quiet instruction. He learned to measure value by craft rather than profit. When he flinched at the sound of a car that might have meant pursuit, Dante answered with resources arranged so carefully they felt like tenderness. Marco's mother stopped biting her nails at night. The leader who had once led the raid kept his exile. Dante paid with favors and concessions that reshaped territories but spared lives. The price was political, ugly in ledger terms, but it bought an interval in which new choices could be tested. Dante, for his part, altered a calculus that had long been absolute. He folded mercy into strategy. He publicly softened his edges, philanthropy, conservancies, carefully timed retreats, and privately shifted networks to protect rather than punish. Men who expected retribution instead found cold, bureaucratic consequences that left no spectacle. His empire thinned and, in places, strengthened in legitimacy. Elena watched him work with a wariness that Ake had taught her, but she watched, too, with a dawning respect for a man who chose restraint as power. They forged a pact that looked nothing like the vows of old. Not blood, not ledger entries, but mutual accountability. Elena would continue to guard histories. Dante would dismantle threats. Marco would rebuild a life. The museum became a small sanctuary, a place where the public engaged with artifacts of human contradiction, objects that had been weapons, tools, love letters, and where Elena curated an exhibit about mercy, the label cards written in plain, stubborn sentences. Opening night, the rain returned, gentle and honest. Guests came for the art and stayed for the quiet story Elena told at the edge of the gallery, about a ledger, about choices, about a woman who refused to let numbers decide who lived. Dante stood near the back, coat collar up, watching her speak with the wary adoration he reserved for few. Marco hovered by the restoration lab doorway, a man learning how to be steady. After the crowd thinned, Elena walked outside. The city smelled of wet stone and new promises. Dante joined her. They did not speak for a long moment. Finally, he took her hand, an ordinary gesture charged by all they had survived, and she let him. Above them, the rain stitched the night to the roofline. Below, in the museum's locked archive, the ledger remained hidden, no longer a detonator, but a sealed history. They had not erased the past, only chosen how to keep it, guarded, acknowledged, and no longer allowed to dictate the shape of their lives. Elena looked at Dante, then at the street where a lone figure hurried past with an umbrella. She exhaled, the sound small and decisive. "We build the future here," she said. He squeezed her hand, and together they stepped back toward the lighted entrance, the museum glowing like a harbor for damaged things. while the rain washed the city into a morning that, at last, felt possible.